So let me tell you about two projects or three projects that we have done over the years. We finished them about 3 years ago. And these were the Rutgers AICPA Data Analytics Research Initiative. And basically, we did two things, maybe three things that were noteworthy, finish up with two of them being the main projects. Now, first, who did we work with? We worked with the AICPA, the Canadian Institute, and the 8 largest CPA firms, the big 4 plus the other big next to that. The generic rule is that the big 4 are about 10 times larger than the next echelon. Okay, so one of the projects, what we call the Multidimensional Audit Data Selection, MADS. Sounds like a fancy name. My colleague won't know, gave it this name, but this is like the main thing that I think the profession should change, but we are not doing very well in convincing the PCAOB or the AICPA to do it, is this full population testing idea. Now, let me explain you one thing. Sardines Oxley created the PCAOB, Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. What is this thing? This is a regulator of auditors in the public domain. What does it mean, public domain? Companies that are listed in the stock exchanges. But there is a whole large number of companies that are not listed on the exchange, and they are not regulated by the PCAOB. They are regulated by the AICPA. And so before Sarbanes-Oxley, the CPA firms were regulated by the AICPA. When Sarbanes-Oxley came in, was during the crisis, just after the crisis, one of the economic crisis. Basically, they said that the AICPA was too chummy with auditors, and so they needed to do something different. And the different was they taxed the CPA firms and created the PCAOB, which is paid by the CPA firms. And it's a little bit weird because the PCAOB reports to the SEC. But the SEC, the employees there are limited by government salaries. So no one can earn more money than the President of the United States. Now, every partner of the CPA firms makes more money, of the large CPA firm, makes more money than the President of the United States. So it's very interesting. The SEC employees make less money than the PCAOB employees. And each one of you, and most of you, will be working for one of the largest firms, will be subject to the PCAOB inspections. And the process goes in several steps. But the PCAOB has its own secret criteria to decide who gets audited, auditors that get audited, what engagements get audited. And then these firms get, and this engagement get reviewed. And basically it's looked at, are they following the rules of audit? But what you already heard from me several times is that the rules of auditing are pretty ancient and they need to be changed. Now, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, I can't remember, the AICPA published the guidelines to dealing with large populations of data. And this was sampling data. And so there are these tables that the AICPA published that basically tells you if your population is 1,000, pick a sample of 5. If the population is 10,000, pick a sample. I'm just giving a amorphous example here. I'm not reading the table. And so that has been what auditors, and auditors are allowed to do also a judgmental sample. They decide how many items they review. Now, that was okay because there was this trade-off between the effort of looking at a sample and the benefit you get from it. And the benefit was basically validating that the numbers were correct in the financial statement. So how did they do this? Just to make the example very simple, they had 1,000 elements on the population. They would pick up a sample of 10, which is 1%. Sounds pretty small, correct? They would pick up the values, examine them, and then multiply it by 100 to see the value of the population. And obviously, it wasn't a very accurate process, and that's the way they did it. Now, these days, populations are not 1,000 or 10,000, they're in the millions. And there was this big development, which is computers. So physically, you don't need to examine a sample to understand to a certain degree what's in the sample. So we have argued for this idea of full population testing. And in the MADS project, we actually talked with the firms, and the big four, each one of the big four gave us what they felt were the variables that needed to be examined in an engagement in general. So they said 2 or 3 or 10 variables to control. And what we actually did is we extracted values using a little bit outlier detection. So let me just kind of show you a little bit what was done there. And so there was the sampling idea. And if you start next year, you'll be doing a lot of sampling, pretty much in every engagement. And what we actually did to that is created a new approach. Advancing data possibility and data analytic techniques allow auditors to evaluate the entire population. So this was the idea. We picked up the sample and we filtered it with the variables that the firms were telling us that they examined. So, gentleman who was a chairman of the MADS project from Deloitte said, well, this is very superior to what's done today. Because instead of you just examining 1% or 10% of the population, you actually examine every item and you know if certain parameters have been violated or they are suspicious. Now, what do auditors are looking for? And I'm being very pedestrian here because you haven't taken auditing. Auditors want to find errors that are material. What does it mean, material? Errors that are big enough that are worthwhile examining. The materiality committee of the AICPA 50 years ago never came to a definite answer of what is material. Typically, people take 5% of net income, meaning of gross profit, as a materiality threshold. So if your profit was $1 million, 5% of it is $50,000. And so you're looking for errors that are larger than 50,000. But this is very tricky because what are you talking about? Is total impact or one transaction impact, etc. There was very little guidance, and each one of the firms had their own way to determine materiality. So we started thinking about this filtering, and we were try to find a method that help auditors to deal with these large amounts of data. So what was done at that time? Okay, we pick up the entire population, and then we filtered, like I mentioned, for significant potential risk factors. So we looked at KPMG's or Deloitte list of variables that they would like to examine, and we filtered them out by looking at large numbers or things that they told us that should be looked at. Based on these risk factors, processing transactions. And we went to the list that the firms had. And let me just go back here. And determine what were the significant risk factors. And we developed software filters to find these things. And we applied the filters. So we picked up the entire population, applied these filters, which was stage 1. And came out with these items, notable items. Why didn't we call them exceptions? Because the AICPA and the PCAOB says that if you find exceptions, you need to examine. So we call them notable items, and the idea was that we would have 2 major stages. One stage was doing filtering, the entire population, and second stage looking at these notable items using some kind of analytic methodology to find what we would think exceptions. Now, then we would create a prioritization of this exception to see which ones were the ones you wanted to examine and chose the threshold of examination. Now, this methodology, in my view, obviously, is clearly superior to sampling, but it probably takes a little bit more resources and more understanding of analytical method. And so this is what we suggested. And I just say one of these days we are going to get to that, but not too soon.